Welcome back. This Veterans Day 2022. And as you know, we honor the men and women, those living, those dead, all of the veterans. We honor them today. And, you know, there's no greater honor than a son writing about their father, who was a veteran, and honoring them. You know, I learned more about my father's experience in World War II and Normandy in the last year of his life than I did in all the other time that I would ask him about it. And he was a member of that greatest generation. And, you know, my next guest and a friend of his had a parallel experience with their dads. And they got to the point where they were able to write a book. It's an incredible book of both pictures and stories. It's called From Boston to Berlin, a journey through World War II in images and words. It is available through Purdue University Press, but you can go to bostontoberlin.org. It's written by Christopher Moriello and Roland J. Regan Jr., and Roland joins me now this morning on this Veterans Day. Good morning, Roland.
Hi, Jim. How are you?
I'm good. I'm glad that you had the time to be able to do this and we could tell this story. Just in reading what I could of the book so far, in preparing for this interview, there's this box of pictures that you as a young man were curious about. Tell me about that.
Well, it starts back in the mid-'60s when I guess my inquisitive stages started. And my dad, who had this box sitting around, and I never took notice of it until probably around 65. And then I started going through the photos. So when I finally cornered my dad, I said, Dad, could you explain some of these? He goes, oh, those were taken during war when I was over in Europe and prior to that phase and a little bit thereafter. And he says, it's just photos I developed basically when I got home and da-da-da. So I said, well, could you tell me, you know, what was this about? Where were you here? And so over a period of about 18 months after, you know, trying to get to get him to sort of stop for a second and relay to me what he knew of these photos, which he did when he developed them, right on the back of them, where he was, who the people were in the photo. And so he looked at it, he goes, oh, yeah, we were here, and this was taken just outside Chateau Thierry in France, blah, blah, blah. And he'd go through that whole process of where they were and what had happened, D-Day itself, prior to the invasion, where they were in Wales and preparing for the invasion in Swansea, Wales. And so I learned very slowly over an 18, 20-month period exactly what photos meant to him and what perspective he gave them. And but the ones that really I felt, and I could sense that my father's deepest sentiments and feelings were the ones when his particular division, they were combat engineers, and they were basically at the front in all, you know, between the river wars in Germany, were entering the Holocaust camps, the out Dachau and Rugerist, and one other camp that they had entered. That's I could tell my father didn't want to talk about that. It was very emotional for him.
You know, it's amazing that, you know, like my dad, didn't want to talk about certain things, the horrors they saw. But your dad's, you know, the way that you put this together with Christopher Moriello, it reads like your dad walked through history. I know the history of World War II well. And in looking at the pictures and where he was and what he saw, your father, while he was a soldier, it's almost as if he was a correspondent, a set of eyes on some of the most pivotal parts of the war, the death camps, the Battle of the Bulge, Normandy, and that he had the wherewithal to preserve it. And then he comes home, Roland, he doesn't talk about it. Not much at all.
He's not atypical, though, as we have discussed, that he's not atypical of that generation that fought during that period, both in the Pacific and in Europe. And it was just that it was a generation that took their patriotic duty to preserve democracy and sign off this totalitarianism that both Nazism and Imperial Japan represented. And he just, I don't think my father was very typical of that generation. He had gone up prior to enlisting in the Army in November of 42. My father had to go to work at the age of 16 and a half because his father had taken ill with tuberculosis, which is fairly uncommon today. But back then it was still raging. And he was an immigrant from Ireland, and Ireland just happened to be a place where tuberculosis was prevalent. And but coming here in 1940, my grandfather passed away, and my father went to work. So he stopped his education in the 10th grade. And being the second oldest, he wanted his brother to finish high school, so he went off to work. And where he went to work was down at the shipyards in Quincy to become a welder and other metallurgists, the capabilities of understanding how to weld certain types of metals. And so he picked up that trade very quickly. And then when he got a deferment for a year, because the draft started, I think, in January of 42, he got a deferment for a while, and then enlisted in November, and then left for the Army in January of 43, and then became a combat engineer.
Amazing. We're talking with Roland Regan Jr., along with Christopher Moriello. Wrote a book about a little more than 20 years ago, From Boston to Berlin, a journey through World War II in images and words, and it is incredible. Purdue University Press has it, and you can go to bostontoberlin.org to get a look at this. I think so many of us, Roland, have these heroes in our lives who were reluctant heroes. They were... Your dad, as you said, he saw the death camps. He was part of a group who saw the death camps, who liberated them. He marched across Europe, liberating Europe. And you would think that someone who accomplished all of that and did all of that would be bragging about it, and rightfully so. But this generation was very humble. I think, well, let's see if you agree with me. Part of it is being humble, and the other part is the atrocities, the horror that they witnessed.
Well, I think this generation came out of the Depression, and I think the Depression had an impact, as it did on many, many Americans. And even though my father always said that he was very fortunate, his father worked all through that era as as part of the Massachusetts rail. And so he really, they never felt the full effects of the Depression, but many Americans did. And I think that had a lot to do with the psychology of this generation when they went to Europe, because they had seen the horrors just via some films and through the newsreels at that time. And I think they prepared themselves when they went over there for this, and but when they actually witnessed it and actually saw it firsthand, I think it left obviously an indelible impression on them, and I think that's why they never really spoke about it or talked about it. Again, two of his siblings, his older brother was in the Navy, and his younger brother was in the Navy just at the very end of the war. But they didn't experience what my father did, and several of his friends who went over there, who were in the Army and in Europe and into Germany. And the other thing my father did state from some of the photos was the river wars, where they were putting these pontoon bridges across rivers of the Saar River, the Ruhr River, the Rhine River, and the Elbe River, which was the Elbe River, which was they were ferrying across I think the 82nd Airborne, I believe it was, to meet the Russians on the other side of the river. The Russians had already just encircled Berlin, and the Russians were on the other side of the Elbe River, and there's some photos, I believe there's a couple in the book, regarding the meeting of the Russians at the Elbe River. And I forget there was a Hollywood director who was over there at that time, and he had gotten word that the Russians were down by the Elbe River, and he ran with his camera crew down there, and they showed this group ferrying across American Jeeps and all that. I think part of that ferrying group was my father and his company that were bringing those people across to meet the Russians.
Now, in addition to the photos, so this really focuses on Roland Regan, your dad, and then Christopher's dad, Frederick Moriello. So your dad supplied a lot of the photos, and then Frederick supplied a lot of the letters, and I read many of them, going back home. This was Christopher's dad, Frederick, writing back home about what he was seeing. It brings it home. But there is an interesting photo of Frederick Moriello with the Statue of Liberty in the background. He was coming home. And it's a grainy photograph, but there he is, and you can see over his shoulder the Statue of Liberty. And you can see the weariness on his face also of the war, and there he is, and he's back home, and he made it, unlike a lot of other soldiers.
Well, my Chris's dad, I believe, was at the front lines as well. He was a radio operator, and I believe, for the artillery, he would give certain directions to the artillery to be sending the shells in a certain direction.
Yeah,
and like my father, being a combat engineer, you're at the front lines, and many of his letters are very poignant, and they're very poignant in the sense that he looks at the way the Army was handling things at the time, and then when the Germans were surrendering, and he makes a very insightful comments regarding that, and also as the war grinds to an end, he does bring up some of his distrust of the military and some of the things that they handle. So it's a really interesting perspective. Chris's dad went on to use the GI Bill and went to Boston College later in his life. But it's really interesting to see how well written those letters are.
And Chris went on to get his PhD in history from Brown University and become a college professor. I think this is an amazing, amazing story that you're sharing with a lot of us, and especially poignant on this day here today. So if you want to get a look at this book, and you should, and I'm going to be going through it more and more, from Boston to Berlin, the journey through World War II in images and words. We honor today Roland Regan and Frederick Moriello, thanks to their sons, and that's how these stories get told. We can, Roland, folks go to bostontoberlin.org. Is that the way they get, if they want the book?
Yes, they can go to the website, and on the website is you can go to the University Press, you can go to Amazon.com, Thrift Books, and to eCampus. All four websites carry the book.
That's great. Roland, God bless your dad. God bless Chris's dad, and God bless all the men and women who continue to serve and have served. Roland, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jim, for allowing us to do this.
It's my pleasure. You're listening to The Jim Polito Show. You are not alone.